Imagine sitting in the suffocating heat of a Havana night. The power grid has failed again. Your refrigerator is empty, your country is paralyzed, and suddenly there is a sharp, authoritative knock at your door. It's not the electric company. It's plainclothes counterintelligence agents from the Cuban Interior Ministry. They aren't asking for your papers. They are asking for the names of everyone in your household. They are drawing up evacuation plans. Why? Because the world as they know it is catching fire, and the flames are lapping at the shores of Florida. Welcome back to the channel. If you want to stay ahead of the most critical, fast-moving geopolitical crises happening right now, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and comment down below with where you think this powder keg will ignite next. To understand the sheer, unadulterated panic gripping Cuba today, you have to look at what just happened on the global stage. The United States government didn't just rattle its sabers, it drew the sword. In a staggering, unprecedented strike on January 3rd, the U.S. attacked the capital of Venezuela. President Nicolas Maduro was captured. Over 100 people were killed in the chaos, and critically, 32 of those casualties were Cuban operatives assigned to guard Maduro. But the administration didn't stop in the Western Hemisphere. Halfway across the world, a major assault on Iran left its supreme leader dead. The message sent by Washington is as subtle as a cruise missile. The old rules of engagement are gone. Now, the island of Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coast, is wondering if the crosshairs have shifted to Havana. President Miguel Diaz-Canel has ordered emergency military exercises, scrambling Soviet-era hardware in a desperate show of force. The island is trapped in a terrifying Faustian bargain. A severe energy shortage, triggered by an ironclad U.S. blockade of foreign oil, has plunged the nation into a humanitarian freefall. Yet the tension is thicker than just fear of a foreign military. Inside Cuba, a quiet, desperate rebellion is brewing. 10 armed Cuban exiles recently attempted a brazen incursion, resulting in a deadly firefight with border guards. To some in the government, this is a dagger to the throat. But to a starving, exhausted populace waiting in endless lines for rotting food, the unthinkable, a U.S. invasion, might just be the reset button they've been praying for. The stage is set. The power is out. The question is no longer if the 67-year-old communist regime will fall, but how many will be caught in the collateral damage when it does. Based on the critical reporting originally filed by Ed Augustin, Francis Robles, and David C. Adams, we are looking at a powder keg scenario brewing just 90 miles from American shores. Just a few weeks ago, the quiet residential blocks bordering a military installation in Havana received a highly disturbing wake-up call. Undercover operatives from Cuba's Ministry of the Interior began systematically knocking on doors. According to local community leaders, these agents weren't just checking in. They were actively demanding the names of every single resident in the immediate vicinity and mapping out emergency escape routes. Why the sudden urgent paranoia? You have to look at what just happened in Caracas. American forces had just executed a massive decapitation strike on Venezuela's capital, successfully apprehending President Nicolas Maduro. That operation left over 100 casualties in its wake, notably wiping out 32 Cuban security personnel tasked with guarding the Venezuelan leader. Seeing the writing on the wall, Havana's intelligence apparatus immediately began scrambling to prepare for a mirrored tactical strike on Cuban soil. And from a strategic standpoint, their panic makes perfect sense. The geopolitical temperature is at a boiling point. Washington didn't just neutralize a vital socialist ally in South America. Days later, the United States executed a devastating kinetic operation against Iran, resulting in the elimination of its supreme leader. Add in President Trump's recent off-the-cuff remarks proposing an amicable acquisition of the island, and you have 9 million citizens bracing for the very real possibility that they are next on the Pentagon's list. The thought of a military intervention terrifies me. admitted one local leader, who demanded strict anonymity for her own safety, a mandatory precaution when discussing state counterintelligence operations. She confirmed that this suffocating dread has blanketed the entire nation. Right now, Cuba is paralyzed by a catastrophic energy deficit, directly triggered by the Trump administration's aggressive embargo on foreign crude oil. It has thrust a deepening humanitarian disaster into overdrive, trapping the populace in an impossible devil's bargain. Make no mistake, everyday citizens are living through absolute misery. A massive segment of the population is desperate to finally close the book on a 6.5-decade-old Marxist regime, famous for locking up political dissidents, crushing public dissent, and driving a rigidly centralized economy straight into the ground. However, the grim reality of an active, kinetic war, complete with the inevitable collateral damage to civilians, is a fiercely polarizing debate. It's dividing the millions trapped on the island and the millions more in the exile community who are praying for the government's immediate destruction. In the direct fallout of Maduro's capture, Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel slammed the panic button, mobilizing state forces for intensified combat drills. But let's be objective about their arsenal. According to Hal Klepak, a history and strategy expert at the Royal Military College of Canada, Havana is essentially flexing outdated Soviet-era museum pieces. Nevertheless, the independent investigative outlet 14Y Medio recently documented heavy military convoys prowling the streets under the cover of darkness. Diaz-Canel himself publicly condemned the American operation in Iran, branding it a blatant trampling of national autonomy and international norms, demanding that global powers step in immediately to halt Washington's aggressive escalation. And the threat isn't just theoretical. Just last week, the regime faced a violent, unexpected breach. Havana confirmed that a 10-man tactical squad, comprised of U.S.-based Cubans, launched a brazen amphibious raid on the island. The ensuing firefight with border security forces left 4 of the militants dead and the remaining 6 hospitalized. So how is the regime interpreting this sequence of events? Peter Kornblue, who extensively documented secret Washington-Havana dialogues in his book Back Channel to Cuba, recently returned from the capital. He assesses the assassination of Iranian leadership as a lethal blade to the jugular of the Cuban elite. It is a blindingly clear message that the current administration is highly willing to execute forced regime change, regardless of any ongoing diplomatic whispers. Yet Kornblue notes that the officials he engaged with are stubbornly clinging to their fierce nationalist pride. They claim the door for diplomacy is open, but they absolutely refuse to negotiate while staring down the barrel of total annihilation. For its part, the White House has largely telegraphed that its ultimate strategy relies on the Cuban system collapsing internally under the crushing weight of financial sanctions, rather than relying on Tomahawk missiles. When pressed by reporters on whether he was eyeing military action in Havana following the Caracas raid, President Trump was characteristically blunt. "I believe the whole thing is just going to collapse. We probably won't even have to lift a finger. It looks like it's collapsing right now. It is absolutely down for the count." Down on the streets of Havana, however, a potential showdown with the world's premier military superpower isn't necessarily the top priority. Many citizens are simply too overwhelmed by an exhausting gauntlet of daily miseries, endless rolling blackouts, empty fuel pumps, and a desperate struggle to find basic groceries at local markets. But flip the coin and you'll find a massive, quiet faction actively hoping Trump goes the distance and accomplishes what a dozen previous commanders-in-chief could not: the total eradication of the communist state. I am certain that a vast number of citizens are holding their breath for him to be the catalyst that finally breaks the system, stated Rita Garcia Morris, who directs the Christian Center for Reflection and Dialogue, a non-governmental organization based 90 miles outside the capital in Cardenas. They want the Band-Aid ripped off, and they want it done yesterday. Still, Garcia Morris passionately advocates for a diplomatic off-ramp, pointing to the apocalyptic conditions currently ravaging the public. Hospitals are halting vital surgeries. Cargo is rotting at the docks due to non-existent transport fuel. And commercial aviation has grounded flights entirely. Speaking from my Christian faith, I simply cannot endorse letting my people suffer like this, she cautioned. Even for a society intimately accustomed to sprawling ration lines and systemic destitution, this specific energy vacuum has pushed the economy into a death spiral. Experts agree it has backed the regime into a purely existential corner. Following the January 3rd strike on Venezuela and the immediate seizure of its energy sector, the U.S. successfully choked off Caracas's ability to ship crude to Havana. That was a devastating blow. The Cuban apparatus heavily relied on Venezuela to supply roughly a third of the 100,000 barrels required daily just to keep factories running, buses moving, and the power grid online. Weeks later, Trump doubled down with a sweeping executive directive threatening crippling financial penalties against any sovereign nation daring to ship oil to the island, a maneuver that dealt a heavy blow to Mexican suppliers. The president framed this embargo as an urgent matter of national security, accusing Havana of executing extreme operations that directly endanger American interests. Without dropping specific classified intelligence, Trump openly declared that the Castro legacy government actively shields and funds a syndicate of hostile adversaries, specifically naming Russia, China, Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah. It should be noted that Hamas and Hezbollah effectively operate as Iranian proxy militias. Consequently, Cuba joins Iran on the devastating U.S. State Sponsors of Terrorism registry, a brutal classification that has completely paralyzed its financial systems and obliterated its once thriving tourism sector. Havana fiercely rejects these terrorism allegations, condemning the fuel embargo as a sadistic collective punishment, while maintaining that their financial ruin is solely the fault of the original 1960 American trade blockade. Behind the scenes, the chessboard is still moving, amid circulating reports that Secretary of State Marco Rubio has engaged in back-channel talks with a grandson of Raul Castro, a figure who continues to wield massive institutional leverage. Havana insists they are willing to sit down, so long as their territorial sovereignty remains untouched. But University of Florida historian Lillian Guerra warns against oversimplifying the endgame. She acknowledges that Cuban elites are sweating right now, and rightfully so. However, she argues that if Washington were to successfully decapitate the leadership by eliminating Diaz-Canel or Raul Castro, it would merely create a power vacuum identical to the one in Iran. You would still be left with the formidable Interior Ministry and the armed forces, the exact entities that maintain an iron grip on the nation's wealth. Since the Iranian strike, Guerra says her phone has been flooded with panicked messages from contacts on the island, terrified of what comes next. According to Guerra, the overwhelming consensus on the ground is a total rejection of conflict. The public is entirely broken down by generations of financial starvation, and access to the internet has effectively shattered decades of strict state indoctrination. Over 2 million residents have fled the island in just the last half-decade alone, and those who remain are entirely burned out. I am so sick of hearing about that nation, she noted, as the most common sentiment. Yet, Giovanni Fardales, a 53-year-old local translator, aggressively pushes back against that narrative. He believes the underground desire for an American military intervention is far larger than anyone admits. From the guys drinking cheap rum on the street corners to the wealthy elites leasing mansions to foreign tourists, he insists the private consensus is uniform. He summarized the mood in a stark, all-caps text message to reporters. Washington needs to intervene so we can finally be done with this. Ultimately, the psychology of the island is deeply scarred by history. Elena Lopez, a Matanzas-based historian known for her critical writings on the regime, recalls her college years in the 1980s. Back then, students were forced into labor camps to dig miles of coastal bunkers east of the capital, preparing for an American armada that never showed up. We have wasted our entire existence running defense drills for an adversary that was forever just about to arrive, she explained. For the average citizen, the daily grinding war against poverty and systemic collapse is far more terrifying than the phantom threat of foreign missiles. Take that military compound, where state intelligence agents were knocking on doors. Today, the surrounding houses are framed by rotting concrete and heaps of uncollected garbage dumped near banana trees. A former high school tech instructor, who now survives by peddling beer and snacks from a nearby street cart, entirely dismissed the invasion hysteria. She insisted that the true terror for everyday Cubans is the grid going dark, the gas lines running dry, and hyperinflation eating away at their worthless salaries. When asked about the military installation towering behind her, whether it was secretly housing heavy munitions or fighter jets, she just let out a cynical laugh. They're running a dilapidated supply depot, she said. The only thing they are hoarding in there, she added, is starvation. Ultimately, the Cuban government finds itself backed into an existential corner, strangled by the geopolitics of oil and the ruthless arithmetic of a modern blockade. By seizing Venezuela's oil industry and threatening punishing tariffs on any nation daring to fuel Havana, a threat that brought Mexico to heel, the Trump administration has effectively turned off the life support on an already flatlining economy. But what does this actually mean for the end game? The strategic reality is complex, and the potential outcomes are as volatile as they are historical. Scenario A is the administration's stated bet: attrition and collapse. The U.S. believes that no kinetic strike is necessary. Under the crushing weight of sanctions, a crippled power grid, and the inability to import crude, the state simply withers. The military infrastructure rusts, public compliance evaporates, and the regime implodes from within, dying not by rocket fire, but by bankruptcy. Scenario B is the decapitation trap. Let's say Washington decides to force the issue, targeting President Diaz-Canel or the remaining power brokers like Raul Castro. As Cuban-American historians warn, taking out the figureheads doesn't erase the deep state. Much like the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, Cuba's interior ministry and military brass control the economy and the weapons. A decapitation strike could plunge the island into a bloody, protracted civil war right on America's doorstep, resulting in massive civilian casualties and a refugee crisis that would swamp the Florida Straits. Scenario C is the back-channel mirage. Amidst the public posturing, whispers of secret negotiations persist. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's reported meetings with Raul Castro's grandson suggest that beneath the threat of obliteration, off-ramps are being explored. Could a negotiated transition prevent a bloodbath, saving face for nationalist hardliners while appeasing Washington? Yet, for the people on the ground, the 9 million Cubans enduring the worst moments of their lives, these geopolitical chess games feel like a bitter joke. They are exhausted by decades of indoctrination, tired of phantom enemies, and worn down by the daily war for survival. As the local vendor near the so-called military target laughed, they aren't storing bombs or planes in there. The only thing they have in there is hunger. The true enemy in Cuba isn't waiting in the sky. It's already walking the streets in the dark. That brings us to the end of today's deep dive. The situation in Havana is evolving by the hour, and the stakes couldn't be higher. But I want to pass the question over to you. Do you think the regime will collapse entirely under the weight of these economic sanctions? Or are we barreling toward an inevitable kinetic military confrontation. Drop your predictions in the comments below. I read as many as I can. If you found this breakdown valuable, please hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to understand the real story behind the headlines. Thanks for watching, and stay alert out there.